I would like to, I'm very honored to announce the next speaker, Dr. Andreja Puharich, coming to us from North Carolina, from Israel. Excuse me. He just flew in from Israel to be with us. Very, very phenomenal man. If anybody knows the book Uri Geller, you know the book? Yes. Okay. Dr. Andreja Puharich wrote the book, and also Beyond Telepathy. And in his research for the psychics, Uri Geller and Peter Herkus, in the research he found out that the psychics are getting their ability from the extraterrestrials to do their psychic powers, to do their psychic feats. And I'd like to announce Dr. Andreja Puharich.
Thank you. Well, is the sound okay? Well, I'll just have to lean over. Excuse me. I'm going to jump right in to my topic. And the purpose of my talk is not to describe the shape of the spacecraft, the velocity, the right angle turns, the usual stuff that you all know. I'm more concerned with the occupants, who they are, why they're here, all the things that never get answered in ordinary UFO research. And as I mentioned last night, I've held back this kind of information for some 37 years because I did not get clear permission from the extraterrestrials that I talk to and I deal with until 2 years ago. The group I work with had a meeting in Hydra in Greece, and suddenly they gave us permission to release this vast amount of material, which I mentioned, some 3,700 hours of audio tape, and it's now being transcribed on a computer for editing and printing and so on. And hopefully in a couple of years we'll get it out. So with the full permission of my mentors out there and the agreement of my colleagues, I'm revealing for the first time a lot of things that even my closest working colleagues do not know. I'll start right in the day is December 6, 1956, and I'm in the state of Maine in my laboratory at Glen Cove, and I'd brought over from Europe about 4 or 5 months earlier Peter Herkus, who is already famous in Europe as a great psychic, and his abilities can be summarized with one word: information. That's what he acquired, information. When you get to Geller, it's not information, remember, it's action. He does things, he moves, he levitates, he bends metal, he teleports, etc., etc. So you have two different kind of people, and you must always remember this distinction between information and action, which most people really don't think about too much. On December 6th, Peter had an experience, and on the next morning, which was December 7th, he came to me very excitedly. He said, he spoke very broken English at that point. I kind of tend to imitate him. So Andre says, you won't believe me, but last night somebody waked me up at 2 in the morning, and I get up and I'm like zombie. I go down to the seashore. We lived about a half mile from the Atlantic Ocean, big cliffs, and you go down and there's a seashore. And he said, I walk in my bare shoes, I don't put clothes on. I get down to seashore and I wait, and suddenly there's a UFO. You know what you call UFO? And it's orange, and it's floating, it's over the ocean, it's not touching anything. And then suddenly 2 men, they look like men to me, come out, and they're about 4 feet tall, he says, and they're dressed in like very thin tight-fitting suits that look very much like leather, but I know it's not leather. And they look at me, and they have very narrow, small faces, look like very old, could be hundreds of years old, maybe thousands, I don't know. And they're very wise, they have clean shave, and they have little caps on their heads, kind of a picture like an elf, okay? He said they just stand there, but they're floating above the water. And they look at me, and I look at them, and they don't say nothing, but I know they're sending me something, but this guy's a great telepathist, psychometrist, I don't get the message. I said, my God, Peter, that's absolutely astounding. Next time it happens, wake me up. We lived in a big 50-room house on the seashore, which was a lab and residence and so on. It was called the Round Table Foundation. And sure enough, the next night, Peter comes to my room. He said, we gotta go. It was, I don't know, 12 midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. I don't recall exactly. And so we go out of the house, bitter cold winter, it's Maine. And I put my shoes on. I didn't go down barefoot like Peter did. And it was about a half mile to the seashore. It was our own property, so we just went across the field, went down the cliff to the seashore, and again, we just waited. Peter said, they told me I gotta go. So same thing happened. Suddenly there appeared in front of us, it wasn't very big, I'd say 13 or 14 feet in diameter, spacecraft. Again, an orange glow to the hull. And suddenly these three wizened ancient beings come in their tight-fitting suits, and they just levitate in the air. And I honestly don't know how long we were there, but I would say at least 5 or 10 minutes. The same process. They were staring at us, and we were hypnotized by them. I didn't know what, if any, information was being transferred, and suddenly they disappeared. And Peter and I walked back, and we tried to figure out if we got any signal from this staring. And neither one of us did. But that was the beginning, the first step of my personal experience with UFOs and their occupants. It was not much of a conversation, obviously. But in retrospect, I feel that, frankly, that we were programmed at that point to do things, because from there on, everything began to happen in this whole field of ufology. Now, it wasn't very dramatic. What happened for a while was that we would see the usual lights that people see out over Penobscot Bay, and we didn't see shapes because usually it was as at night, or they were flying overhead, and that was a little confusing because we were about 40 miles from a SAC base at Limestone Air Force Base at Bangor. But we had enough indications that we were seeing so-called flying saucers, but we did not see anything tangible like we did that first night on the seashore. The next real event that happened actually in 1970 and 71. What happened briefly was that we had a meeting in New York between scientists, psychics, and parapsychologists. We had some of the top physicists in the world there. And the reason we called the meeting, it was at Wainwright House, if any of you know that area in Rye, New York. And the argument and discussion was, nothing's happening in this field. It's dead. There's no action. There's no movement. And I remember there's a very famous Professor Abraham Peiss, we call him Brown, who's professor of physics at Rockefeller University. And he was one of the favorite pupils of Einstein, and is really a great distinguished physicist. And at the conclusion of all this discussion, and at that time we heard about Kalagina in Russia, who was able to take a small cylinder, like a aluminum cigar cylinder, and kind of look at it and make it move a little. Well, some kind of electrostatic effect that we don't realize. But Braun really made a great point. He said, look, if you can clearly prove that a human being can move an object that small. It's under a bell jar, it's vacuum, you can't influence it anyway with air, heat, and so on. And you can move it a millimeter without question. He said that would be the great scientific revolution of the 20th century. And we said, yay, good idea, let's find somebody. I swear, minutes later, a special delivery came for a fellow named Itzhak Bentov. Some of you may remember him, he's dead now. And it was from a friend of his, wartime friend, when I say wartime, back in 48, who's an intelligence officer, whose name was Shiloni, Colonel Shiloni. And the letter briefly described that there was some kid in Israel, his name was Geller, nobody had ever heard of him, and that he had done a show at the Technion Institute. Some of you may know that that is kind of the MIT of Israel. And this kid had come along and he asked everybody to bring broken watches, and he'd put his hand on the watch and they would start running, and he would bend metal and he'd drive blindfold. And the students were very sharp at the Technion, and they knew that they weren't conned or fooled or anything like that. And so Shiloni was informed about all this by his son, who was graduating, and so he took it upon himself to get Geller into his office and check it out himself. And he felt the phenomenon was genuine, but again, he was not a parapsychologist. And he wrote hastily to Bentov what to do about it. So the meeting was suddenly centered around this letter, and I was elected by the group to go over there because I had the most experience in doing weird kind of research. And so it took a little while to make all the arrangements, but by early 70, I was on my way to Israel. And I'll never forget, this is kind of an amusing side story. I'll never forget the first time I saw Geller, very young man, he was about 22 at the time, and very good looking, tall, slim, and so on. Had been a paratrooper in the '67 war, and even though he was very young. And the nightclub was a typical sleazy Mid-Eastern nightclub, and it was called the Zorba. And the audience was sleazy, everything was just awful, you know. I said, when the hell did I get into this thing? It's like the Dante's Ninth Circle of Hell. I mean, it was bizarre. So anyway, I watched the kid from the audience, and everything he did, you know, any magician could have duplicated, because it was a show. It wasn't anything serious. So I wasn't at all impressed by what he was doing. So he came over to my table. He was told I was there. And he sat down and he said, you know, I hate scientists. That was the opening statement. I said, well, you know, we're very interested in what you're doing, and we've never heard of anything like it. And I really, you know, I'd made contact before, but finally we met. And I said, we really, you know, are very serious about this, and we won't do anything to expose you or embarrass you or anything like that, but we need your cooperation. He was like, I hate scientists. I mean, it was like a litany with him. So finally he agreed to meet me the next morning at the apartment of a friend of mine. And so we met at this apartment. And I said, I understand that you do things to watch. He said, yeah, I make a move and all that stuff. So I had a chronograph, a stopwatch, mechanical analog watch. I said, well, can you do something to the watch? And he said, oh, yeah, I'll try. And he went like this. He cracked his knuckles. And I looked, and the watch hands had moved 25 minutes forward. I said, that's a pretty good trick, you know. So anyway, the next thing was, I said, I understand you bend metal. And he said, yeah, I bend metal. He was very cool about everything. So Colonel Shiloni and his wife, the one who introduced the whole thing, was there. And Colonel Shiloni's wife said, well, could he bend my wedding ring? And the husband looked and he said, are you trying to break our marriage or something? Anyway, she took off the gold band, and Uri was allowed to put it in his hand, and he closed his hand over it, and I held my hand over it, And about 2 minutes, he said, okay, I think it happened. I opened up, and I picked it up, and the ring, gold is the most difficult thing to bend or split because it's so soft. A hard metal is much easier. And as I looked at this ring, here's the ring, it just cracked here. It started to bend like this, like a lock washer, okay? And it was just moving by itself, you know, as I was holding it. Well, that was very impressive. So I immediately shipped the thing off to the United States to a fellow named Bill Tiller, who's the head of the Material Science Department at Stanford University. And he was very good about the whole thing. He ran the thing through the test as soon as he got in 3 days. I heard from him. He said, we've never seen anything like this in metallurgy. He said, where that ring cracked, a part of it looks like it's been burnt with a laser, and the other part of the end looks like it's been fractured at 0 degrees Kelvin. So he'd never seen anything like it. And he said, what were the conditions? And I explained it. So there's no way that you could have a high temperature thing and a super cold thing in Geller's hand. Well, that was the start of it, okay, just to give you an idea. So finally, Geller agreed to work with me, and I rented an apartment, set up a laboratory, people loaned me equipment, and so on. And I did a lot of preliminary stuff, and I realized the guy was for real, but I also realized it was so far out, nobody would believe me. So I started making arrangements to get some well-known American figure, not a scientist, but like a spaceman hero. And I got hold of Ed Mitchell, the astronaut, and he agreed to run experiments in the States when I got ready to bring Geller over. Now, the next series of experiments, very crucial, follow this very closely. In this experiment, I'd already learned that if I sealed metal samples, which I'd had machined and prepared and radiated, all kind of things, and sealed them in a box, metal box, wood box, any kind of box where he couldn't get at it, that he could make the object disappear from inside the object, inside the canister, whatever it was, by just putting his hand on the thing. So we did a number of these experiments, and each one was more fascinating than the last one, because essentially what you were dealing with was a piece of metal inside of a plastic or wood or tin container. It didn't make any difference which, and the thing would strain through the molecular structure of the surrounding canister, and it would disappear from view, and then it would fall out of the air onto some other part of the room. And with little practice, Geller could make it fall there, whatever. And it was really mind-blowing. Never anything like that had been reported in scientific literature. Okay, now we come to one experiment. I thought, what I got to do now is to have several layers of material that the thing that disappears strains through. So I happen to have one of the old-fashioned Parker pens, which they don't make anymore. Mind you, this was 1970. And it had a heavy brass cartridge inside. And that brass cartridge contained the writing material. And that was screwed into a plastic case. Okay, and then there was the cap. So you had the metal inside, a plastic layer, and before I did the experiment, it was just normal precautions. I would scratch a serial number on each part, just so I knew if it came back it was my material. So to make a long story short, Geller put his hand on it very quick. He was getting used to these experiments now. And he said, okay, I think I did it. I said, what do you think you did? I don't know, but I did it. You know, he was very cool about the whole thing. So I opened up this case. This test happened to be with a wooden box. So I opened the wooden box. I was disappointed because the thing was still there, okay? It didn't go anywhere. But then I picked up the box and I realized something had happened because the box was much lighter than it had been before. So I picked up the pen. I realized that the brass cartridge must have disappeared because it was the only heavy thing in there. So I took it apart, and sure enough, the brass cartridge had disappeared. Now again, through the plastic, through the wood. Okay, Uri said, look, I'm tired. Why don't we split and get something to eat? Let's go over to my girlfriend's house. She'll make us something to eat. So jumped in his car, drove over there. The girl's name was Iris. We would say Iris. And Uri said, hey, you know, I'm hungry. How about making us something quick to eat? She said, well, how about some eggs? He said, yeah, that's fine. So she reached in the refrigerator, took out about 6 eggs, very cold, and put them on top of the stove, got a pan, put the eggs in the pan, turned around to do something else. She came back and was going to put the pan of water and eggs on the fire, okay, gas stove. The eggs are boiled already. The water is hot. I mean, this is a matter of seconds. Uri says, my God, we got to get out of here. So what are you talking about? We just came here to eat. The eggs are ready. He said, no, we got to get out of here. Something hit me when I saw that those eggs being heated by, you know, something out there. So I said, okay, I'm tired myself. So we jump in his car. Uri's driving. Uri's sitting beside him. I'm sitting in the back. He said, Andrea, he said, I just have to tell you this. He said, I don't know where we got to go. You got to tell me where to go. I said, oh, you're kidding. I don't know Tel Aviv. You know, it's an endless winding street and all that stuff. He said, come on, do it. So for a laugh, I just sat back and I said, okay, go forward, go right, go left. I didn't care. I was just playing the game, you know. And so we went about 12 miles out of Tel Aviv toward the old Lud airport, which is now Ben Gurion. We were going by a high wall, I'd say about 20 feet high, of dirt. And we all felt simultaneously that we should stop. We got out of the car and we heard this strange sound. It went buck, buck, buck. So we climbed up to the top of this 20-foot embankment, looked down in a big excavation for an apartment building, and there in the middle of the field was a UFO. Clear as a bell with a blue, somebody mentioned earlier the blue light. I guess it was Antonio in his talk, or you did. Anyway, there was a blue strobe light on top of the craft. You could see it clear as a bell. It wasn't very, I mean, it was not quite dark. It was twilight, so it was very easy to see, especially with this blue light flooding the area. And I said, hey, we're going to finally see a UFO. I mean, you know, the real thing here is waiting for us. So we walked down the embankment, slid a little bit, get to the bottom. I said, I had my Super 8 movie camera, and there's all the tape recorder, you know, and the old boys got ready to go. And Uri suddenly stops me. He says, you cannot go aboard. Only I can go aboard. You take care of Iris. So Iris is standing next to me. Her knees are knocking. I don't know whether you've ever been in imminent contact with a UFO, but most people freak out. I've learned that from experience. They cannot deal with it. And so it was with poor Iris. I comforted her, and Uri walked toward the spacecraft, and I didn't see him climb up anything. He just, like, vanished. There were no, you know, apertures or openings and so on. And I kept taking a movie of him walking into the craft, where I don't know how he got in to this day, and the blue light, which was a good thing to film, and that's all I could do. So I swear I stood there for maybe 20 minutes by the clock, but it seemed like an eternity to me. Time suddenly slowed down. And all I could do was just stand there and wait to see what would happen. Well, suddenly, Uri comes back, you know, Lurch in the Addams Family thing. I swear, I hope I don't lose the microphone, but he's walking toward me like this, totally out of it, and he reaches over and hands me, guess what? The pen that had vanished. In that moment, my universe exploded. Everything collapsed. I mean, it was like the giant quantum collapse. I mean, I suddenly saw it all, that it wasn't his powers, that these people had caused the thing to dematerialize. They'd picked it up in their spaceship, they'd influenced us, you know, the boiling of the egg instantly and getting in the car and telling me to, you know, via Uri to just tell them where to go, and I just played the game. I don't know what I was doing. and we wind up at a site where there is a genuine UFO. And so the thing took off, just zip like that, and it was gone. No sound, nothing. And I was bitterly disappointed, of course, that I couldn't go aboard. So I took Uri to a coffee shop nearby, and we sat down and said, Uri, before we say a word, draw what you saw. So he drew two robots, android. The most remarkable feature, they're kind of shaped like with a head, they had limbs and so on, but they floated across the floor. They had some anti-gravity effect. They did not walk in the normal bipedal sense. And he described the power plant, he described all the interior, and I still have the drawings. And suddenly, as he finished this, a crucial moment came. He looked at me and said, Andre, what the hell are you doing with that camera? Oh, I said, I filmed you going in, I filmed you going out, and so. He said, you can't. He shoved his hand, I don't know how he got into the film part of the camera, but he pulled out the film, held it like that, and it vanished right there and then. I said, oh, I cursed him. I said, my evidence. I mean, I'm a researcher. I can't go on, hearsay and all that stuff. I said, Uri, for God's sake, please do me a favor. Try to bring that tape back. He said, okay, I'll try. So we dropped the girl off at her apartment. We went back to my lab. And Uri said, okay, I'll concentrate on it. And for some reason or other, unknown to me, he stood by the sink and turned the water tap on, and he held his hand like this, and I could see his hand filling out, and there the tape cartridge reappeared. And he said he had to put his hand under the water because he said his hand was so hot. And I'd already promised, I didn't mention that, to destroy the tape. I just want to see it come back and what his relationship was to the people in the spacecraft and so on. So I had a horrible 10 minutes in which I pulled out the film tape and clipped it and flushed it down the drain. Again, my evidence is gone, but that's a recurring theme. Okay, now I suddenly began to understand something. I wasn't just looking at a human being who could bend metal, repair clocks. I was looking at very high-tech activity at a distance, and this repeated thousands of times. And what all that amounted to, I'll just tell you quickly without going into all the endless details. Eventually, I took Uri to 22 university laboratories. We did a whole stint for over a year at the Stanford Research Institute and so on. So we got an enormous amount of data, but the one thing I want to emphasize is it was a teaching exercise for me. It showed me that hard objects, metals, animals, anything could disappear, even in sealed environments without any damage to the environment, that they could be teleported elsewhere, and that they could be returned from elsewhere, and that these people in the spacecraft had total command of material systems without going into all the endless details. And that was an incredible lesson. Now, we had that first initial contact with the space being, with the robots on the spacecraft. From there on, we were absolutely flooded with sightings, with photographs, with Uri began to disappear in front of me, and he would appear somewhere else. Could be 50 feet away, could be 10 miles away, and I'd have to find him. I mean, and some of you may know the story from the book he wrote, my story, that when we were in New York, when I brought him over the States, that he was jogging on 51st, 57th and 1st Avenue. He loves to jog every day. It's a big thing with him, 10, 15 miles. And as he was jogging, I reconstructed the story later on, he suddenly began to go backwards. And the next thing, and seconds later, he was crashing 37 miles away into the gazebo porch on my house through a screen door, and crashed a big glass table, and on it went. Anyway, I found him. I was the only one in the house at the time, And I thought it was an earthquake. I lived in California, so I know what a good earthquake feels like. And anyway, I eventually found him on a porch, totally out, because he crashed in this heavy oak table with a glass cover and so on and so on. And I quickly felt around. I felt sure that he'd been injured, cut by the glass, by the impact, and so on. There was no mark on him. And he teleported instantly. It took him about a half hour to come to. I mean, it was really a sudden, again, remember the words, dematerialization of his body, and somehow rematerialized, which is an incredible problem in physics, how that occurs. And the first thing I did when it came to was I figured that with this taking apart of his material body, that the first thing that would happen would be his memory was wiped out. I mean, from what we know about neurophysiology of memory. Well, sure enough, there wasn't a gap anywhere in his memory. Okay, now we go on to another aspect. This study went on for about a year, and it went on in New York. It went on, took him to Cambridge University, Max Planck Institute of Plasma Physics in Germany. I had various types of scientists look at him. For example, there was a Dr. Karger at the Max Planck Institute in Munich who had some ideas about how to pursue this study in a really totally unknown realm. And his idea was very simple, and I went along with it. He took 2 pieces of solder metal, lead solder, but it didn't have a rosin core, it was just pure lead, with a little tin in it. And he kept one sample for reference, and he gave the other sample to Uri. Uri just held his hand. He didn't know what was going to happen. And, as God is my witness, what happened is absolutely true and can be verified. He opened his hands, and the piece of dull lead color was now shining gold. And the other sample was unaffected. Karger did a spectrographic analysis, and Uri had actually transmuted the lead into gold. Now again, I'm saying it's not Uri who did it. I learned to differentiate between what he could do with his own powers, and I'll give you a quick example of that, and what his ET friends would do. Now, as I say, all this was really an education for me to understand who I am dealing with. So we had not got into intimate conversations with the ET. The next step in this process, and this is where we begin to find out who we are dealing with. Uri and I sat down, and we're back in Israel now, in my lab. Uri and I sat down, and I always had a tape recorder ready to record anything, and a movie camera to record that. Oh, thank you very much. So,
You're welcome.
I'm not going to bend the spoon, folks. I usually try to get him relaxed. I mean, you have to remember he still had a bias against scientists, and it wasn't easy to get him to work. And there are a number of things I wanted to do with him, but in this particular instance, I just want to find out about his childhood, his life on Cyprus, and his life on the kibbutz and so on in Israel, and his life as a paratrooper, as I said, in the army, and all these things, background. So I sat down, tape recorder, and we talked, had a little coffee, and I looked down, and suddenly I see some invisible fingers pressing the buttons on the tape recorder, and it starts going. I picked up an earphone to monitor, and there was a voice which I call synthesized speech. It was not what comes out of a voice. I'm quite an expert in the area of speech and hearing, and much of my medical life has been spent in that area. So this was not a voice box generated speech. It was synthesized speech, but pretty good. And it was in English. And it started out very ponderously. Andrea, we have decided, I'll tell you why I can't play the tape for you. we decided to contact you directly and reveal to you what your mission is and who we are, etc. So I said, fine. I talked back to the mic, and it was all recorded. This went on for about 2 hours, the first session. And at the end of the session, they said goodbye. And suddenly, I looked in the tape recorder, and another shock hit me. My evidence was gone. The tape, the mechanism, the plastic housing, everything had vanished. And I screamed. I said, "My evidence! My evidence!" I was so upset. But I had the experience. So anyway, I remembered what was said very accurately, and I wrote it all down. So the next time we sat together, the same thing happened. The tape recorder started moving. I put the monitor in my ear, and the same voice appears, and I'm mad still. I said, "You took my evidence. I'm a scientist. I can't deal with, vanished objects. I gotta have hard proof." I said, "Nobody believed me anyway, but still I want the proof." So they said, "Well, we cannot leave, listen to this, we cannot leave our energy on your planet. It would affect you." So I said, "Look, I'll make a deal with you. I'm a poor researcher. These bloody tapes cost me $5 a piece." When we finished this conversation, I said, "I'll promise you that I will copy the tape first with my handwriting, and then I will wipe it out, and then I can keep my tape, save the $5, and you don't have to leave your energy on the planet." So they agreed to that. And to make a very long story short, I had 52 such sessions. The communication was all through the tape, and I have them recorded in 12 volumes of folio leather-bound books, and it's probably, 30,000 words or so. But that was the key material, and there's no way I can obviously, tell you all about it. I can just give you highlights. Eventually, as I say, we'll publish all that stuff, and you can read what's next on the big talk. But here are the basic points. The civilization behind Uri is called Huva, spelled in English Hoova. And the person I was talking to was called Yehovah, according to his own pronunciation. You get it? Okay? Right? Yehovah, from the Bible, okay? And the next, information beside the name was that it's a very small civilization. They have 6 or 7 planets. They are, listen to this now, I don't remember the exact number, it's in the book, 53,000 light ages away. Now, a light age is 100,000,000 light years. I mean, it's beyond any astronomical concept we have of space and time. And they said, as I said earlier, they're a very small civilization, perhaps 100 people on these different planets. They normally live to be about 1,000,000 years old. And that's why we saw these wizened little people. They were ancient. I don't know how old, obviously I didn't ask about that, but they could have been up near the 1,000,000-year mark. And that their work, their mission, was to seed life on dead planets, start life from scratch, if they thought the planet could support life. And that's what they did with planet Earth billions of years ago. We estimate the Earth probably was formed about 4 billion years ago, but it's only an estimate. Nobody knows for sure. And about 3.4 billion years ago, the Earth had cooled off enough so that water could form, the steam would not boil everything. And then they started to see life. And they told me the entire procedure, which I won't bore you with, how you create life. And I recreated that procedure of forming primitive form of life, which is blue-green algae, in my laboratory, and I published a paper, and I produced life by their recipe. And from there, you have to wait billions and eons of time for the different species of life to rise. Now, I tell you, I was chicken at one point. I created the blue-green algae to the point where they would, replicate, but not by modern methods of DNA, because DNA didn't exist at the level of life I had created, but it would fission. In other words, a cell would grow and then would split, and then it would grow and it split, which is a known process. And this is the most primitive form of life that science recognizes as having occurred on Earth. Blue-green algae of that type are all fossils that they find. Their evolution has left them behind. So I learned a tremendous amount about how life was formed from these conversations. And not only that, in the process, it didn't happen quickly. It was like a 2-year project. In the process of learning how every atomic element could be put together and then transmuted, that was the second part of the process. I learned how what's called weak biological transmutation occurs, and it was very complex once I got into that part, because it required fields of certain pulse height, pulse shape, current, voltage, etc., and a frequency. So this is the kind of stuff I learned from them. Now, what was the benefit of a thing like that? It sounds like a sterile academic exercise, doesn't it? It wasn't. In that process, I learned how normal living things develop cancer. And then I learned how to cure cancer. And I got together with several other people. We did this work, finished it about 1981, and gave a paper at an international congress. And in that process, I learned how to treat cancer. And we've been treating cancer with ozone gas ever since then, with thousands of cases. You can't do it in the United States, by the way. It's illegal, and for stupid reasons. And I would say that our success rate is about 90% average for 5 years, for example, samples as we do cancer research. And then from that, I went the next step when the AIDS thing became big around 82 and 83. We applied the same treatment to AIDS cases, and we've got thousands of those cases now. And again, we have about a 90% survival rate of people who had only 1 or 2 weeks left to live. So you see what kind of civilization you're dealing with. They give you a little game to play. Okay, create life, big deal, right? I'm very excited about it. But in that process, I had to learn myself how it can be applied to human problems. And we haven't got mass application yet, because there's an FDA ruling that says no American physician can use ozone in treatment of any disease. Whereas in Germany, any doctor can use it, and other countries have done it for 50 years, but they didn't learn how to do the cancer part. We learned that, and we taught some German doctors how to do that. So anyway, we're kind of stymied in that area. Now, there's another area I'm going to bring up, which tells us a great deal, again, about the people we're dealing with. Now, mind you, by this point, you've already learned that they can materialize, which I haven't gone into very much. They can materialize objects that you need or want. They can teleport them. They can rematerialize them. They have a complete anti-gravity system, which I'll get into later. I went to work on that, and I can explain to anybody's satisfaction how you create anti-gravity. Anyway, but that wasn't the main point I wanted to get at. Again, back to Israel, we're 1971. And after that first event when Uri put his hand over my analog watch and it jumped ahead 25 minutes, I began to have, on a daily or bi-daily event, which was that my watch would stop and stay stopped for sometimes as long as 2 days, and then it would start up again. So being a scientist, I had a notebook, it's about that thick now, and I'd record every time the watch stopped and every time it started up again. And the way it worked, I don't want to go into details, it's very, hairy and minuscule. I figured this was a code. And I'm sure you're asking the same thing. Well, why don't they have to give you a code? Why don't they just speak over the tape recorder or over the telephone or through the television? There are many, many different ways they would communicate. And I learned after 4 years of collecting this data why they did that. It was because they wanted me, all on my own, listen to this, learn their language. And for a lot of reasons, which I won't go into, I've studied many different languages, kind of a hobby with me. I finally set up a code where I could decode. Essentially what I was looking at in these stoppings and starting was an angle. So I reduced the code to angles, and then I tried every known language that I could get my hands on to see which one would fit this problem. But there was only one key that I had. The clue was that this was a biliteral root language. That means every word had only 2 letters as roots. Now, modern Hebrew, those who know Hebrew, every word has a triliteral root. It's 3 letters are the root word for that particular configuration. So I went ahead and did a trial translation. And I don't go through all the thousands of steps I had to go through. Mind you, I was working at this for 4 years. My preliminary translation yielded the following: an ancient form of Hebrew which had disappeared except a few stones that were scratched in the Sinai desert. And that's how it is known that originally Hebrew was a biliteral root language, only had 2 roots for each word. And using that as a guide, and the way I found out what each sign meant, I mean, this is madness going through this, but I determined which of these angles was which letter in the Hebrew alphabet, okay? That was another challenge. And then once I had done that, I then paired these words off in the sequence in which they came as 2-letter words, okay? And from that I got some meaning. And the meaning was quite rational. And what I found out, which is very important, was all this material was forecast for the future from what would happen to humanity from 1975, mind you, I started this in 70, to the year 2000. Okay? And the reason that was important was it gave me a chance to test the accuracy of my translation. Everything was in the future tense. And I'll give you the example of the first thing that came out clean. I happened to be in Boston in February something, 5th, lecturing, and the translation said as follows: on February 6, 1976, there will be a giant earthquake at latitude and longitude so-and-so, which turned out to be Guatemala, and this will be the beginning of this final age. So I stayed at 3 a.m. it would happen, this giant earthquake on your Richter scale, 6.7. So I stayed up all night at the hotel, and nothing happened over the radio or any news source. So I fell asleep, went down in the morning, get a piece of paper, big headline, giant Guatemalan earthquake, millions lose their homes, and 25,000 dead already as near as they can tell. So that told me that my translation, which is, mind you, in an unknown language, an unknown code, was accurate. And from then on, I followed all of these forecasts. Now, I've got to say this in all honesty. Several people know that I released this forecast in the year 1980 at a little meeting in upstate New York. Some of you know Lilydale, who are from upstate New York. And it was a little meeting like this, it won't be long remembered and all that sort of stuff. And I thought I'd drop it out and see what the reaction was. Well, it happened to be a very unusual group. And they seized on it. I recorded about 9 hours of audio tape, gave them all the data points, and so they would follow the prophecies or projections in this material. And all the material was ecological. It would say when volcanoes would explode where, how much sulfur would be thrown in the air, how much pollution this would cause. It would speak about the ELF used by man, which I described already, and how much damage it would cause to the ozone layer, and on it went with very specific predictions. And all I had to do was check it, or my colleague could check it, and it was, no inaccuracies, let's put it that way. It was seeing the future clear. So I thought to myself, gee, maybe they're causing all this. That's why they know the thing. So I got back to them on the, there were different modes of communication. I don't want to confuse the issue whether we use channels or whether papers would materialize from the air with the typewritten information, or the thing would come over television or radio. There were 27 different modes of sending signals. And it was all, as I say, for my education, to see who I'm dealing with. So I felt that this was very real, and that it was telling me, and I'm supposed to tell mankind, that man is running into an incredible ecological disaster. And I bring you up to date now. This data, which as I say was released in 81 at Lilydale, and they sold the tapes for a year, and then they gave up. 1990 is the crucial year. This is 1990, as we all know. What will happen in the 1990? They've already predicted the disease, the AIDS, all the things that are going on, and the devastation and mysterious storms. There are all kind of freak storms that occur. For example, 2 years ago in London, there was a windstorm that no weatherman saw, hit the center of London and just tore it all up. I don't know if any of you were there in October of 20th of 1987. And those windstorms are still continuing in France, England. They just had some big ones. We've had them on the East Coast and so on. And in 1990, they said there'll never be a nuclear war. I just want you to know that, because they said they will squash it, just a thought that there's no nuclear war. But the ecological disaster is brought on by man himself, which, believe me, in 1970 or 75, where nobody was, they had Earth Day already, if you remember, in 1970, but that was kind of a house cleaning operation. Nobody is looking forward to total disaster. And I'm telling you a line which frightens me, but you've got to know what's going on. They said to me, be prepared for all to perish. I can't tell you how I felt when I read that. Oh my God. So I spent years going around the planet, like Chicken Little, the sky is falling, you better clean up your act and so on and so on. But nobody listened. As long as, you can buy groceries and the soda pop's rolling in, people don't care, and the gasoline is there. You can't reach them. I know that. So I gave up some years ago on that sort of score. But the crucial thing now is what will be the effect on humanity of ecological collapse, which means either too much rain in some areas, not enough rain in others, crop destruction. Last year in the United States, we had a kind of a preview of this. We lost 50% of our grain crop. And to make matters worse, the government released the huge stores of grain that we had in our ever-normal granary program, and we're down to practically zero on the stored grain. And that was to help the Russians and other countries that, didn't have a decent crop. Of course, it was sold and money was made on it. But we're at a point where it doesn't take much to tip the balance of nature in order not to get a decent crop to feed everybody. And as you well know, we're well over 5 billion people on this planet, and it takes a lot of megatonnage of food to keep them going. So you have to keep your eye very much on what is going to happen this summer. I'd say by August, which time crops are estimated and harvest, we will all know what we're up against. And just imagine what you would do if you had this knowledge. Would you go to your congressman? Would you go to the FDA? Would you go to the Environmental Protection Agency? Would you go to the president? Where would you go? How would you do it? Would you just mobilize citizens group? The task is so overwhelming. Yes, we have all of those things going. But when you're talking about total crop failure to the extent that people cannot survive, you're talking about something very, very serious. Now, all of this is not going to happen in this year according to forecast. It's going to happen, we'll know, August 1990, and they give a date on it, 91, 92, and the whole thing will climax in 94. So we've got a little band there. And I'm all for saving the human race. I don't want to see them die, but you can't mobilize anybody. Believe me, I have tried, and I don't want to bore you with the stories, but I got to President Reagan, tried to warn him about this coming on, and I had a private audience with the Pope, and he kind of saw the problem, but what could he do? And I went to the Eastern European countries. Hey, gee, that's nice, but, we can't do anything about a thing like that. That's, catastrophic. And then to make matters worse, again, when I'm saying this, you have to remember that my sources of information is not from me or from the newspapers or Time magazine. It's from the ETs. They want us to survive. But there's a fundamental rule which I haven't brought out in many of these conversations. They bring out over and over again, the fundamental law of the universe is free will. We are not allowed to override anybody's free will. Now we can tell you, and they tell me why, they tell me, that we can warn. That's not overriding your free will. And then you Earth people talk about your free will being overridden by some of these extraterrestrial people. And by then I had known, I don't want to go into all the details, but I collected hundreds of what I call space kids who could levitate, band metal, be geniuses in music, so on and so on. And they are a superb crew. And it was that way I found out by deep hypnotic regression, sending them back to their home planet and finding out the civilization they're from. And that's how I found out there are actually 24 different civilizations that send spacecraft to Earth, and they all have different missions and functions. You have to remember that. They're not uniform. They're not homogeneous. And in the process of learning about that, I found out, again, both from ET sources and from mothers, like Daddy would be away in the wars for a year, and Mama would be alone and swore she was faithful and true and all that, but she would get pregnant, didn't know how, and she would have a baby. And a lot of times I was in a position, particularly in Mexico, of delivering the babies and following the children and so on. But anyway, the main point is that another thing that the ETs do, and this is all the civilizations combined, because this is a crisis planet, they implant on the Earth their own new genetics, so we put it that way, in a mother, and then the mother gives birth to a child, and the child grows out to be an Uri Geller or somebody like that. And a lot of these kids are now, that I've worked with, are most of them born in 47, 52, 56, and so on. A lot of them now are mature people. They know, because they've gone through this process, who they are. They know what their mission is, what they're supposed to do. And it's a very funny thing how the ETs work. Would you believe that a lot of these kids have become brilliant academics, and I could name where they are, but that's not important in terms of identifying them. But they have all worked themselves, listen to this, all over the world in a position of political power where they're an assistant to somebody who really has the power. And they're always there at the critical moment to say, well, maybe we should do it this way. And they're all being programmed from one source. And you know about this tremendous burst of freedom all over the planet in the last 9 months? All space kids. They're all put in the right place to lead a march, to advise, to generate the energy like Geller will bend metals or bring down ballistic missiles or missiles and so on. These people are there to, they're like yeast in a vast mass of humanity to get it to bubble. And I don't know the full mechanism. I'm still more astounded than anybody, knowing these space kids are out there, how this thing happened. For example, 2 years ago, I spent an awful lot of time in Czechoslovakia because I was lecturing, doing other things, but I was dealing with space kids there. And I talk at great length about their political problems, how they're shackled, and they tell me the horror of living in that type of society. I mean, to give you the worst example, the school teachers are instructed to get the kids to squeal on what their parents talk about at home. Can you believe that? But anyway, that sort of thing that led to the boiling of the pot. So you have all these kids scattered around. Then there's another sad part I got to tell you. When I first found out about this, again, back in 70, 71, mostly through these energized tape systems, from their source, I found out that they have done this many times in the past, coming down to Earth to help. But they would always do it in the same way. It's like the Trojan horse story. They would get the kids on the planet, born on Earth, so they had regular bodies and grew up like regular people. And they never were told who they were, how they got here, what their mission was. Somebody had to come along and wake them up, as I did, and send them back to their planet, and they learn the whole thing, they come back. So I said, well, I'm very happy to do that. That's, why I did it. I said, just kind of in passing, I said, what's the success rate of this mode of entering into human life and human dynamics? He said, you won't believe us. And I didn't believe him. He said, in the past, for every 100 we have sent to Earth, one would make it. I said, it can't be. They're superior beings. They're, civilized. They got new genetics, everything. He said, they come to Earth and they get lost in the mire of sex and power and, ego and so on and so on. And I can tell you truthfully, it makes me cry when I say it, that's the batting average that I've found so far over the past 30 years in working with these kids. It's the rare one out of 100 who makes it. And I can't tell you how bad that makes me feel, because every one of them should have made it. But of course they have no matrix in which to live that would give them the possibility of being strong and powerful and leader and all that, even though they have learned who they are and what they're supposed to do. Every story is tragic, every one that we lose. And so this is part of the mechanism of how they work on Earth. Now, some of you may say, well, how does this have to do with the Charlie Hicksons, with the people who've been picked up in a spaceship and so on? The answer is incredibly simple, and you may not even recognize it. What they told me is that of these people who they send back to Earth, each one has a different function, a different mission, because it depends on which civilization they come from, what is needed here, and so on. And what they told me was that these people who are picked up, not by one civilization, but any one of them, have already agreed before they came to Earth to be used as demo models like Charlie is used. He's a man of great integrity, honesty, and he has this experience. It's not very big, but it's, major in terms of saying it to the public, making testimony as he is doing, and many others are doing it. So that is another mechanism that people who deal with abductions and all this kind of stuff don't even think about, because they don't know that's a mechanism. And some of my good colleagues in this room, like Leo and so on, I don't know whether you've run into this in your hypnotic work on subjects, but that's a very important point. And the key is very simple. When I do it, it's totally non-suggestive. I don't lead them. I just put them out. I have a finger, and this is a frank confession that's been programmed. It has an implant in it, and I put my finger right there, and they all kind of swoon out because a specific ELF frequency comes out of my finger. It's 8.00 hertz, and that puts them in a state that they are ready to go. And when they get out of their body, which is very quick, they suddenly are out in space, and they say, well, what should I do now? I said, very simple, find a spaceship. And in a matter of minutes, they find one of their spaceships is actually waiting for them. And they get in the spaceship by, dematerialization and so on. And then they say, well, what do we do now? I said, head for the sun. And they have to find their own way. I don't tell them how to find the sun. When they get to the sun, inside the sun, you won't believe this as physicists, it's cool. And there's a temple in there, and there are monks from their civilization, there another civilization. They take them in and start processing them for the next stage of the journey. And so when they're processed, doesn't take long, matter of hours, they're off on their own and flying through space and are guided by what we might think of as a huge bird, but it's actually a huge spaceship. And it guides them to their own civilization. They land. Oh my God, I remember I said I'm going to make it. And I said, well, go on the Hall of Records in your civilization. And they find their name and their mission and so on. And that's when they know what they're supposed to do. Now, everybody should have this experience, right? If you've been dumped on Earth and you've got a thing to do. So instead of, floundering around and being the 99 casualties out of 100, you maybe do your job better. But that's not the way it works. A lot of these people are picked up, and it can all come out under really deep hypnotic regression. They remember, or they're re-stimulated on the spaceship to get back to where they belong in terms of life on Earth, not back to their home civilization. So there's a whole different fabric of experience of living. Now, I must make this very, very clear. There are negative forces in nature, in UFO civilizations, that sort of thing. And I've gone into that in great length. Now, what they explain is not that you're dealing with a kind of a Christian, Satan, angel type of relationship. It's not, how shall I say, predatory. What they explain is that you can't have a whole positive set of laws without having an equal and opposite set of laws to balance out nature. For every thing that goes this way, there's another thing that goes this way in the dynamics of, let's say, gravity alone. And they said they need the opposition to keep them in line. They're not so goody-goody that they do everything perfect. They make mistakes too. And that idea appeals to me. So whenever I've had the experience of running against what we call the opposition, I kind of welcome it. I figure it's a good challenge. It's like having a set of barbells that you can develop on instead of thinking it's a torture system. So that's another subtle angle about the balance of forces in nature. Now, another point which I bring out, which I think is very important, in the course of these dialogues over the year, being a scientist, I always want to know how it works. That's the big thing, You're like a little kid. You got a tinker toy to put together, and you want to know how it works. Many of my questions are purely technical, scientific. I want to know how nature works. And so another person who has come along, besides Geller, and he's got a tremendous, powerful role in the world still to carry out, and I've already mentioned Herkus and his total dedication to just one cause, prevent nuclear war on Earth. That's all he ever did for the presidents and the Navy and so on and so on. About the same time that I found Geller, a psychiatrist friend of mine in New York named Joe Gross walked into my place up in Ossining, New York, and said, "Hey, here's a girl who works for me, and I want you to meet her." So a tiny little girl, looked like a teeny bopper. I mean, no maturity, and probably about 21 years old at the time. And I said, "Well, what's so good about her?" She said, "Well, I don't know about these things but she's got tremendous psychic abilities, and she shows it all the time in the office." So, I didn't pay much attention. She looked like a little doll had been dragged in off the street. So we had lunch, and as we sat down to have lunch, there was Joe, my friend, and Sharon is the name of this lady, and myself. And Joe and I are talking shop, basically, what we're doing. And we kind of reach a lull point. She suddenly opens her mouth. She hadn't gotten 5 words out of her mouth, and I knew this was a genius, just like Geller was a genius in his way. It turns out, make a very long story short, that she comes from another civilization which is pure science, pure knowledge, and how the universe works. And it wasn't 2 days later, but she joined our staff, and I've been working with her for 19 years now. And whenever I have a problem in anything in physics, she goes into it. I'll give you a simple example. I already knew the answer by calculation. I said, I've already been able to measure healing energy coming out of the hands of a lot of people. It's a very specific frequency, and it is of a certain nature. We call it scalars. I won't go into defining it, but scalars are not electric fields, not magnetic fields, not electromagnetic field, but they're known. They've been known for 100 years, but no engineers use them. They don't know what to do with them. And the interesting thing about a scalar, somebody was talking to about submarine warfare and ELF. The interesting thing about a scalar, it'll go through the whole Earth without interacting with anything, more so than a neutrino will. So anyway, to make a long story short, I said, where does this scalar field, and I described to her, where does it interact with the body? Why does it interact with the body when nothing else will interact with it? And she very calmly looked into the heart of the proton, which is, 2 protons make a hydrogen molecule, and she found out that in the DNA, this proton, which I think everybody knows what that means, is hung between 2 alpha helices, which are the 2 components of a DNA molecule, and they bind the 2 alpha helices together to form the DNA and the spiral and all that stuff that we know about. And she could precisely tell me, which I've never revealed and it's dangerous to reveal, exactly which frequency would hit which proton in the DNA molecule to create either a curative effect or a negative effect or produce cancer and so on and so on. So between us, we were able to map out, it didn't cost much, like a cup of coffee twice a day. It wasn't a big budget project. And then I duplicated the frequencies with equipment which I designed, and we can actually get healing effects based on the knowledge of this lady who has a super high contact out there somewhere. And whenever we have a problem, she says, let me listen. And she hears the voice and tell her what to do, and she draws it all out. And as a result of the collaboration with this space being, on Earth, the one who's making it, I was able to, and I just finished it a few weeks ago, formulate a complete theory of all the forces of nature, including mind, shows exactly how mind works, what it can do, what it cannot do, what anti-gravity is. It's a frequency function which we can define and which is easy to test experimentally. In other words, from this source out in space, we are able to, and it had nothing to do with UFO contacts, in this case, as I described earlier with Geller, we get any knowledge we want. So what Sharon and I have decided to do, I've taken her to several international physics meetings, and I give my little paper, which is kind of routine and dull and dry, and then she says how she sees these things. Well, every physicist, and there are really world-class physicists and Nobel laureates, run over to her like they got a new microscope or new telescope, and they finally see here's a tool to peer in the universe beyond any known instrument that science has developed. And they just ignore me, you know, I'm just a keeper of this lady. And it's an incredible experience. So anyway, based on that, like Brian Josephson, the Nobel laureate, invented the so-called the Josephson junction, which is in all of electronics now. And he still doesn't know how it works inside, but she looks inside where the junction is and how the electron goes, and she describes in minute detail what's happening, and intuitively he knows she's right because he knows the input-output function. And he thinks like she's, goddess from heaven to help researchers. So in view of that, we decided to form a small institute, which is unknown, the kind we're planning, which is to have her at the institute, have some support staff, and we would invite one-on-one physicists who are really interested in this type of approach to physics, and have them come and stay there a week or two, whatever, and work with this lady and get the answer to their insoluble problem. I'll give you a quick example how this might work. Everybody in this room has read that Texas is getting a big super collider, and it's going to cost $6 billion the first crack, and they're going to bang electrons and positrons, and they're going to discover what quarks are. Well, this is such a joke to us. We solved this problem years ago. We know exactly what a quark looks like, and she can see it. We know how quarks appear out of magnetic monopoles. We know how magnetic monopoles appear out of pure space, which is going faster than the speed of light. It's all worked out. Here these guys are going to blow $6 billion and maybe never find the answer. You see the new way of doing things, and it's not me, we're being helped. Mankind needs new sources of energy that are clean. We cannot go on with nuclear radiation, with burning coal, with pollution, and on it goes. And one of the worst problems, as you all know, that we have is, and you'll never see this in any paper, even a scientific journal, because this ELF warfare has been going on, the U.S. has about 8 giant transmitters, 100 megawatts each, around the South Pole. The Russians have about 12 of them, about 100 megawatts each around the circumpolar area, and they're banging back and forth with these gigantic power levels. I mean, they're off the chart. And then they wonder why the ozone molecule breaks up. You can take the same effect with a smaller voltage and show right on the laboratory bench that you can break down ozone molecules into, atoms and so on. So there's another way that we can be helped. And we've been shown, which sounds like science fiction, ways to prepare metal, gold specifically, by transmutation, and use it as a kind of a mica flake and dump it up in the atmosphere, and it will start catalyzing the healing of these big holes. All this is, 10-cent research. Isn't it? You don't need the 100 billion megabuck approach to these problems. But, scientists can't see that because they're hooked to budgets, they're hooked to equipment, they want to look like Superman with the big machines and all this stuff. So all this is possible, but I don't think you can get I've tried, you can't get anybody who's, heavy-duty scientists to listen to this sort of stuff because they're used to big science. You can't do anything without $1 billion, right? That's the starting point. You got to build a big building like the 52-mile track out in Texas to do the atom smashing, and on it goes. But all this can be done with the use of the mind. And that's an incredible thing. Anyway, so we're going to set up this little institute and hope to attract leading scientists, not get up in front of a large audience and tell them what it is. Get the scientist there to work intimately on his major problem. Solve his problem real cheap, maybe a little computer time, nothing big. Then he can go back to his lab and confirm it in terms of acceptable, credible evidence, and we may have a solution to major problems, and the major problems are endless. there is sewage pollution. You can't find any pure water on this planet anymore. Everything is polluted, and that's been pretty well proved. They did a test in North Carolina recently. They took, by random sampling, 139 water wells. There wasn't one that wasn't polluted, and we have pretty good water in the state of North Carolina. So the problems that we face can be helped, and this is very important, with the aid of extraterrestrials, and they want to help, and they've done a lot that nobody knows about. How many of you have ever heard about space kids who are seeded on the planet? One or two, see? And, yeah, so this is very important. We should treasure these people instead of running them down in the ground as being freaks and outcasts and off the wall, all that sort of thing. And many of them, as I mentioned earlier, are very key spots in governments all over the world. Some of them are key scientists, growing up, getting their wings. You'd be surprised the kind of scientists we have at our command, all young people who have incredible ideas and so on. But how do you get this heavy mass called government, science? I sound like Leo Sprinkle, right? There are solutions. You can prove it in a preliminary way, and you can certainly prove it in a rational way, how these things work. And I think if mankind really can get together, which, mission impossible, except thank God we have the example of what happened in Eastern Europe, then I think we'll get more help. So, because, believe me, the ETs do not want the human race to be extinguished, because they've invested literally billions of years in nurturing us from the sea to where we are now. Another thing that is very important, let me see how I can phrase this one. There are not only new genetics on the planet, as I've explained, with people, but the same thing goes on with animals and other creatures and plants. In other words, they have quietly been going around the planet and starting new species to help us survive all the pollution and so on. And if we could only latch on to that instead of being stuck to the agricultural system now. First you have to flood the field with a lot of chemicals, because that, make a lot of money doing that. And then you have to get hybrid seeds which don't reproduce, as you know, because that way you have to pay every year for the seeds and so on. And there's a lot of indications that the vitality of our agricultural crops is going down, not just because of pollution, but because of the way we treat the genetics with chemicals and pesticides, and goes on and on. So there are many areas of work, and you have to remember, I'm just one person. I can't keep up with all this stuff. I do the best I can. I give enough talks, I guess, around the earth, but I can honestly say that the idea has not caught on, that the ETs are here not to make sausages out of us, but they're here to help us survive. And there's a lot of this stuff going on in the whole field of ufology about abductions and making hamburger meat out of people, and on it goes, and the cattle mutilations and all that. You have to remember, and this is a very important point, that the U.S. government and other governments in the world have what we call flying saucers. They got it from the Germans in the end of World War II, and they brought the technology here. I know the names of all the people and how it happened, and they want to keep that a big secret. And a lot of the stuff that you experience, let's say with cattle mutilations or abduction, are done by our own idiot people to scare people. Stay away, absolutely true, stay away from flying saucers. They're going to eat you up. This is not coming from outer space. And 90% of the sightings, I would swear, I haven't done a big sample, but I would swear are people seeing our own flying saucer craft. And the history of that is totally buried and hidden, but, there are ways of getting at the truth. And that's one of the reasons I'm in hot water with our dear government, is because I just say it openly. Look, your big secret is a lot of bullshit. I mean, it's been known in Germany. We know people who did it. There's names and so on. What are you trying to hide? Big deal. But, you can't be a military man without having a secret. I mean, it's like being little kids with, little toys. So we have all these problems to overcome. And I really think if we could get the discussion of the material out of the area we're in, we're bogged down, we're trying to prove we're credible, we're trying to do this, we're trying to do that, we're kind of fascinated by the flickering lights in the sky, and who are these people, where they come from, are they going to gobble us up, are they going to help us, are we going to be transcended and transformed like the Christian idea? We're doing it all wrong ourselves is what I'm saying, and I say that from these contacts I've had, and I hope we can get all this material out so you can read the nitty-gritty details as it has built up over since we made the first contact that I didn't mention on December 31st, 1952. So it's been a 37-year collection of wisdom, and just to feel the good vibes of these people, I'm talking about them, is very important. There's so much confusion on that one area. And, we have Satanists to confound the issue. We have all kind of people with weird ideas. They're not straight arrows in the sense we're talking about, ethically, morally, biologically, and so on and so on. So anyway, that's about all I can say at this point, but I've kept you kind of captive here. It's only 9 o'clock. And I would like very much to interact with you and some questions and so on. And they have a microphone there. I think it'll help everybody to step up. You can get in the line and give your questions, okay? That's all right. Pull the mic down. No, there's a thing there. Yeah. Okay?
I know that you said that the ETs are very aware that we must express our own free will. But is it possible at all that these 24 civilizations that have visited us and genetically encoded the planet ever get together to decide what's going to become of us?
They get together all the time. In the Bible, it's there, for example, remember in the book of Revelations, those of you who look at the Bible, there's the meetings of the Council of Elders, that's what they call it, and there are 24 of them. And these are the people who are meeting all the time, the leaders, trying to get together. Don't forget, we're not the only species, we're not the only planet that's in trouble. There are perhaps millions of them. And there's a sad thing I must bring out in answer to your question. One of the real problems from their point of view is this. They say that all of us evolved through a sequence of civilizations. It's like if you're not doing good, you get recycled into this earth, but if you've learned the lesson here, you go on to another planet. And there's this big beltway pipeline in the sky, and they say the biggest thing that bothers them is for some reason or other, people who've gone through the Earth experience get attached to the whole drama and the noise and the sex and the whole business, and they keep coming back. They won't go. And would you believe that this planet has become a bottleneck in the pipeline of souls going through and evolving? I mean, it's a weird idea, but I speak confidently because I've looked into it in many ways. And, people wonder why we suddenly went from 1 billion people 100 years ago to 5 billion plus. And they think, well, we got better agriculture, we got more crap, blah, blah, blah. That's not the answer. The souls keep coming back, and they want to stay here, they want to have the good time and all that sort of stuff. They don't evolve, but they're causing an enormous bottleneck, as the ETs say, in evolution. Now, that's a little sideline you ought to think about. Yes, sir.
Yes, my question relates to your discussion of their language. It reminded me of something I had read by popular astrologer Linda Goodman, who feels that the remnants at Stonehenge are actually representative of language anciently.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe you could apply your talent for deciphering language to Stonehenge and see if you came up with anything. Have you tried anything like that?
Yeah,
And then, just as a postscript, do you have any thoughts? It's a little bit different, but as long as we're in that area, any thoughts on the wheat field rings?
And the what?
The wheat field rings, the rings that seem to be patterns in the wheat field that are...
Oh, the wheat field. Sorry. Well, let me first comment on the first part of your question. Well, Linda's a very good friend of mine. I've known her for years. She's incredibly brilliant. And I think what she says is true. I've gone over to Stonehenge. It was part of my research to crack the code. And I've looked at the alignment and the solstice and the various, things. And I've also read over very carefully Sitchin's, suggestion about how all the clocks of the world are based on Sumerian circles, 12 divisions, and each division points out into one of the zodiac signs and so on. So I've gone through all that, and it's a fruitful area. Anyway, if you see Linda, say hi to her. I haven't seen her for a while. About the other part of your question, about the wheat fields, I think I'm as puzzled as anybody, and I must say, I have a certain pride. I hate to ask questions when I should be able to solve it myself, but I haven't had the opportunity to go to England, look at the wheat field, and so on and so on. I feel intuitively, without evidence, that it is a sign from the ETs, I don't know which civilization, and there's a message there that should be decoded. And I just don't have the time to work on it, but I'm sure there's some of you people here who have access to going there and so on, could start the decoding process. Yeah.
I wonder if you have any input on the research into cold fusion at this time, which seems that this could be an answer to some of our energy problems.
Thank you for the question. Does everybody here know what cold fusion is? In all the papers. For those of you who don't know, a fellow by the name of Pons and his partner out at Salt Lake City took deuterated water, that means heavy water, and they were able to get what they call fusion. As deuterated water, you would have the two hydrogen atoms or the helium atoms, they're not which, sure, fuse together and thereby cause the production of a lot of heat. Anyway, the chemistry is very simple, but if you know the story, they released their first information about a year ago. I think it was March 15th, a year ago, and they said, we were able to get fusion on the kitchen sink, literally, in a little bottle of water and so on. And they didn't realize what an insult that was to the billions and billions and billions of dollars invested for the last 30 years in hot fusion, so-called tokamak and so on. The government supports that very heavily. And they should have been smart enough not to step on these guys' toes. But the net result was that everybody in the hot fusion area came out of the woodwork and jumped on them and tried to squash them totally. And I felt very bad. I read all the scientific journals, about 40 a month, and I saw that they had something going in that cold fusion process. And I'm not bragging, but I did that in the process I described earlier of creating life. I found at which point you could get what they call cold fusion. I don't call it that. And so I sent them a paper of mine that I'd published just to give them a little hope and cheer them up a little that they're not alone in the world. And they're having a conference, as some of you may know, this week in Salt Lake City to try to bring the new data to bear and see if they can revive the work. They're well funded by the state of Utah, by the way, so they can go on. But I think it's a bad rap. Oh, terrible, terrible. You have no idea. They're just being run into the ground, try to destroy. But I think there is I've done it myself, I know how to do it. And there are critical elements that they don't know about, but I'm applying for
I
patents
think
on
the
them.
ETs would help them on that.
The
It'd be a
what?
nice thing because it would be free energy for the
Well,
planet.
that's one of the routes to free energy.
The economic base
Yeah,
would change the economic base of some of the stronger
yeah.
people, but
I think it's a hope, and I wouldn't write them off. I think they've got something, but again, they don't understand what they did because their instruments cannot measure what happened. That's the problem. And if I had, again, Pons and his partner, forget his name, come to our lab, we could set the thing up in 10 minutes. I've got all this setup, and have this lady look into the process. I would solve it.
do you think they would do it? Have you ever suggested?
Well, I think they're desperate. I think they would look at it, especially if we did it secretly, But anyway, it's on my agenda, something to do, because clean energy is absolutely vital or we'll all perish.
Thank you, and I agree with what you're saying.
Thank you.
Very well.
Yes. Good.
The extraterrestrials give messages like you're polluting your earth and so on, and you could harvest energy that's free. Now we have learned that sun energy is free and water power is free. Have you experimented with magnets? Because I learned in Laramie from one exhibition showing and proving that what magnets can do. The coincidence with Billy Meyer's last photo on the spacecraft explains that the magnets on top of one of the newest UFOs has magnets inside of the upper area that are outside of the spacecraft built all around. It looks like bolts are kept apart, bolts that are round on the top, flat, and then in between that looks like a belt around, which keeps, and he said, they told him that the magnetic force between the two magnets gives them the light and the energy to fly. And if they told that to Billy, have you experimented with that idea to look into the magnetic force that is free? And there are factories here where you can buy magnets at it. And I play with magnets on health and healing.
Yes, I will respond to your question. When I do my little, here it is. Can you still hear me while I'm drawing here? No. Okay, I'll draw and then I'll speak, okay? These are called magnetic monopoles, and nobody's ever discovered them yet, although they were predicted by Paul Dirac, the great mathematician and Nobel laureate, that matter is fundamentally organized from magnetic monopoles, which simply means when you talk about magnets, for example, you're talking about a magnet that always has a north pole and a south pole. These are only single poles. These come directly out of the matrix of pure space, and they're the source of pure energy. In other words, you can't take a magnet that, as you described, and really get useful free energy out of it, because all the magnetic fields are tied up by the north-south coupling all along. So that's kind of obvious. But again, I'll make a little drawing. I'll just make these like this, like this, like this. These monopoles combine into triplets, triangles, and oh, thank you very much. And again, I'll get back here. It takes 9 magnetic monopoles to form a proton. This is what the $6 billion is to find out in Texas, and we already know this because we've been working on this for years. If you manipulate these magnetic fields out of monopoles, but not big bar magnets, because the amount of energy you get out of those is weak. But out of this you get energy at the level of hot fusion, but without using tremendous amounts of energy to line it up. So basically, this is a protest. That's the way you go to get the solution to the problem. And this is what space beings use to get energy. But they get it out of water. And that's been well described by the Germans, a fellow named Schauberger, and that's what the Americans copied for their flying saucer. You also get anti-gravity and you get linear propulsion. So this is the way we should go. The experiments with bar magnets and all that, I've read most of them, are very interesting, but they don't give you a lot for your money. So this is the way to go. And the way the water works is a whole different story, but it was discovered by an Austrian game warden, believe it or not. And he discovered this principle by watching waterfalls in the forest at night in Austria, and he would notice that trout would come up the stream and they'd go up over the waterfall, but the way they would go up was they would twist. And he finally was able to make a machine, which is available to anybody who wants to look it up, that describes perfectly anti-gravity. So that's the basic component. Okay?
I'd like to know, I do believe that there's someone that I know is one of the space kids that you speak of. And I do believe that this person will be one of the ones that will succeed. Can you give me any suggestions?
Suggestions for what? I'm sorry, I don't...
In how to keep this going.
Oh, keep him going.
A space child.
Yeah. Okay, first, it's very important that they are independent. You can't push them around, you can't bully them, you can't say tie or tie, do this, fix your hair. They have this incredible fierce... I have a son like that, so that's why I speak from experience. He's a genius, but you can't even suggest anything to improve. They got to do it their own way, okay? So that's very important. But at the same time, without encroaching on their space, you got to give them a lot of love and support. They really need that. And thirdly, you've got to help them in what their talent is. They make
Get into that is because they're light, or they want to exit physically their body.
That's part of
get into the high.
That's part of the problem. The earth is yucky to them. I mean, that's simple. Everything looks like shit. I mean, no question about it. I've talked to many of them, and that's why they try to escape with drugs, hallucinations, and so on. But they've got a terrible time on this earth because they remember a far better golden world before. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't have a question per se for you, but I certainly, you sound a tad discouraged.
No, I'm not discouraged. I'm just tired. No, I'm not discouraged.
But then I got the wrong impression, because I wanted to come up here and tell you I feel very good about things, and the fact that you're talking about these experiences, and I feel honored to be in the audience, and very encouraged to. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you, but I've been on a long trip, and I just haven't really bounced back. A couple of days sleep and I'll be okay. I never give up. I want you to know that. I'm not discouraged. I know it's a tough road. I'm very realistic about a battle. And but if you've been on the road like for 20 years, as I have been, trying to get this idea across, it's discouraging that people just don't react. And it's their own necks that you're talking about. You're not, talking about anybody else, but all of us are in this boat together, so it's pretty hard. It's like the old casting of pearls before you know what, and it's hard to keep going.
Okay, would you share your knowledge and information of the aliens, including the Mexican pyramids? There's inscriptions on their walls and all, but in the year 2011, there's a mass sighting, a collection of UFOs on the planet Earth. Could you share your knowledge and information of the aliens about that?
Well, I can comment on it, but I don't know whether this is what you want to know. Years ago, I got curious about the pyramid structures on the Earth, particularly the Egyptian pyramids, the Mexican pyramids, and the Chinese pyramids. How many of you know that there's a great pyramid complex in China? Okay, it's at Xi'an, Xian, which is the beginning of the Silk Road. And to make a long story short, as I say, I developed all this equipment to measure ELF, and I figured that sometime in the past, and I did ask the ETs about this and they confirmed it, but I still had to do the measurement, that at one point mankind knew how to keep the Earth in balance, and they did it with these pyramid structures. So my job was to measure them and see what the balancing factor is. And if we had those working, it's the reason I started this vast project, we wouldn't be in such a bad shape ecologically, because those things kept everything in balance. And so my first step was I took my equipment into the Great Pyramid at Giza and measured and found the spot of resonance that it resonates at 8.00 hertz. Then I went to Mexico and I found out they have a different construction, and the resonant point is not in the pyramid, but it's in the platform that the priest supposedly stood on. That's where you measure the 8 hertz. But it's related to the pyramid complex. So when I got to China, after great difficulties with all this heavy equipment and stuff, I don't know what they thought I was, but anyway, it was a real challenge. I measured, and the Chinese pyramids are built exactly, in this esoteric sense, like the Mexican pyramid, and using the same platform as I'd already measured, I found it was at 8 hertz also. 8 hertz, by the way, is the healing frequency. The watch that I developed, which is back there, oscillates at exactly 8.00 hertz. So healers who heal people, and there's some great healers in this room, I don't know whether you know them, when they heal somebody, they put out 8.00 hertz. So all this was known some long time ago, the way to keep plants and animals and people and, everything going is to gently radiate them with 8 hertz, and you have a healthy planet. Now, I'll tell you how wild you get when you try to sell this idea, okay? I'm talking about government, I'm talking about warfare, I'm talking about a lot of things. So I had the idea for a while, since there were these giant ELF transmitters, and they're putting out frequencies which are bad for your health. The Americans like 10 hertz, the Russians like 15 hertz, the Israelis like 12 hertz, and on it goes. And they're all destructive, okay? We know that from a lot of tests. So my thought was talk to the, leaders of the country. As I told you, I did the Reagan thing, the Pope John Paul II, the presidents of East European countries. I actually got to Gorbachev, to his physician, and so on. They couldn't see the point. So I figured, well, that's lost out on that one. So I finally got the wild idea, since all these big transmitters, you can think of them as pyramids as an example, are all running at different frequencies, but essentially they're in the hands of technicians. So you kind of crawl on your belly through the barbed wire, and you get all the technicians. You say, hey, in the middle of the night, tune this thing to 8 hertz. But you know how long you last trying to do that. But anyway, it's still a viable idea, because all these transmitters now are sitting idle since the Russians and the U.S. stopped bombarding each other. But there are ways of getting at this problem that nobody would think of, and that's one of them. Everything's in line. They're very easy to retune, and you might get the Earth back into a nice green state, okay?
I am thinking by that message. In 2011, they've got hundreds of thousands of UFOs occurring in the Earth's atmosphere. There's going to be a mass migration of planet Earth. That's what I feel from the message.
You think that's going to be before this kind of
I
collapse?
think it's going to be an Armageddon, and man's going to be purged and cleansed with a lot of wars and teach him his lesson. We're going to bad karma before he is evacuated. That's what I feel.
Yeah. Again, I've discussed that issue with the ETs, and they say man has got to bootstrap himself. I mean, they can step in like that and cure it all, but what would we learn? Zilch. It's like a parent giving a child $1 million inheritance. What the hell does the kid do? He squanders it. So it's a very strange moral dilemma, and I think it's more a dilemma to us because we want a bailout. It's like our SNL bailout, you know, I don't know, what are they up to now, 150 billion or something astronomical. And sure, everybody could bail them out, but the crooks are still there, all the problems are still there. And you have to remember, we might get bailed out, but we go back to a sewer planet. I mean, sewer, S-E-W-E-R. So there's a little bit of thing there that we have to consider and discuss. I personally, on my own, I would rather sweat it out and make it, even though I have to give up everything that I think is important. And like even hit the road and just be a preacher for this kind of ecological cure, then get a bailout. I think about it, it wouldn't help us any. Sure, we'd get saved, but we'd go back into the pan as a bunch of big fat sausages. We wouldn't have learned a thing. We've really got to sweat it out on every stupid level. Just like I had to sweat out this 5 years of cracking the code of non-known language. Very difficult. Okay, yes, sir.
Okay.
To come down to one specific question on a terrestrial moment you discussed, it almost feels moot after the sweep of this talk, but it's an important point to me. Several months after the storm of October 1987, I was in England. I was about 70 miles away from London, and I saw damage that I had never seen or imagined in a natural setting. I grew up in a hurricane zone. I know what a 100-mile-an-hour wind can do. In chatting up local folks there and a confidence from some people that I did have a relationship with there,
Yeah.
the sense was that this was unnatural, and because it is an area in proximity to two highly secured NATO facilities, one of the thoughts that kept being expressed directly or indirectly was that this was a weather modification experiment gone amok or some man-made thing that had run awry. I was wondering if you had any information or idea on that.
Okay, you know these storms are not natural. They haven't happened in hundreds of years since weather records were kept. In this prediction that I told you about through the clock business, they said that in this time period, they actually always give the time period, if necessary, the latitude and longitude where it'll happen. They said there would be what they call mysterious storms, which means nobody would understand them. And we've already seen 6 or 7 of them. I think there'll be a couple of dozen more coming from the forecast. Now, again, I don't run back to them every once in a while and say, okay, what's the mechanism? You know, I can put on a computer and see it and blah, blah, blah. I accept that it's a message in itself. And if people don't see it as a message, just like somebody asked about the circles in the fields in England and so on, there's a message there. There's a message in the storms. There's a message in the volcanoes like El Chichon in Mexico that blew up, and I don't know how many hundreds of millions tons of sulfur appeared in the air, and you know, all kind of things happened to the weather and so on. So I think all of us kind of have to take it as a personal responsibility to figure it out. And I'm sure that right in this room, I know some of you very well, you have the power to fathom what's going on and pass that on to your fellow man because you have these insights. But the main thing is people just don't realize that it's a problem that they have to solve for themselves. So that would be my answer. And I tried to solve it, but I don't have these unusual capacities like my friend Attell here and the lady who isn't here, Sharon, and so on. But they do have the capacity. All you have to do is point out the problem. They go to work on it. So that's about the best I can do. Okay.
experience here and share us with you? Could you explain your UFO sighting?
Maybe I better do one little thing. This is
Just a little thing.
I'm not going to bend the spoon, don't worry. The most amazing sighting as part of my experience, I haven't gone into sightings,
You didn't?
really big sighting. In the Sinai Desert, Uri and I were teaching the Israelis how Uri can block radar, he can put false images on a radar, how they could shoot up a missile and he could immediately bring it down. They would run a 60-ton tank right at him to crush him, and he'd mentally stop the thing, so on and so on, all kind of military exercise. And we finished this particular exercise, and a sergeant major, a non-com officer, and a colonel drove three of us. There was Uri, myself, and an American parapsychologist named Isla from Wisconsin, and we drove through the Mitla Pass, if you know the geography at all, heading east to an air base where we would be carried to Tel Aviv. And I don't think we were more than 15 miles past the mountains that the Mitla Pass goes down. I happened to look up on my left, and I saw the most incredible flying saucer, if that's what you call it. It was really a spacecraft. I couldn't swear honestly how long it was, because in the desert, the air is so crisp and clear, you have no reference. I didn't know how far it was from where the Jeep was up to the edge of the Mitla Pass and so on. But being an athlete, I judged it to be about 3 football fields long. Football fields about 300 feet. And so that's somewhere around 1,000 feet. I looked at this thing, and it was pure silver, and the shape has never been reported anywhere. And I got these 2 spoons
That's
from...
what the spoons are for.
The spoons are for. But here's what the shape of the thing was. Here is the length of it, long. All metal, no rivets, no openings, no windows, nothing. It seemed flawlessly perfect. But at one end, you know how 747 has the cabin in the first class section with the big bump, you know? But that was one end, but the other end, the bump was the other way. But this was huge. I mean, this alone was like half of a 747 plane, this little section.
Wow.
And this thing, well, the point of the story is this, and I learned a bitter lesson then. I'll tell you what the lesson is. But I nudged Uri and said, look, I see it. And then we nudged the other lady, and she saw it. So 3 of us saw it. So we wondered what the 2 officers were seeing, because it's as big as a Broadway billboard. You couldn't miss it. So Uri spoke to them in Hebrew, and he kind of fooled with them. He said, hey, there's some... Huh? Oh, I'm sorry. He said, I'm looking up there, and there's something funny up there. What do you men see? And they looked, and they looked. They said, there's nothing there, just cactus. Listen, that thing followed us for 2.5 hours, floating like a dirigible at our speed, 60, 70 miles an hour. And the 2 officers never saw the thing, and we saw it as clear as we, see you. So I learned then, I never forget that lesson. That was just another lesson, that number 1, they can control your mind to the most fine sensory detection ability. The 2 officers never saw it. They were driving the Jeep. They were in perfectly good shape. And we saw it as clear as a bell. My only regret is we're in a war zone. We're not allowed to bring cameras that, I could photograph that. But I'll say in advance that I was speaking to my friend Zachariah Sitchin, who will be here tomorrow, and I was telling him this story, and he looked at me with amazement. He said, when I finished the 12th planet, I was predicting where the space port would be in the Sinai. It's exactly where you say you saw this craft. And he said, I made a deal before I published 12 planet that I could go to Israel with a camera and go over the area and take all the photographs I want. The Army said, fine, but you have to turn over the film to us because we have, security areas and so on. We don't want film. So fine, he took all those pictures. He didn't see a thing. He just kept shooting the landscape where he said the spaceport was in the book. And Anyway, to make a long story short, when he got back to Tel Aviv, he was on the airplane. The pictures had not arrived. The plane was revving up to take off, and suddenly the courier came with the film and the prints and gave it to him, and the plane took off, and he started looking at the pictures. He got a photograph of the craft that I saw, and he's never released it because it spooked him out, because all of his literature is, all of his research is in literature. He deciphers old languages, old tablets, and so on, in Sumerian, Babylonian, Egyptian, and so on. So independently, he got proof that I had seen it, and I gave him confirmation that somebody else had actually seen it, and he had the photograph. So that's just an idea, not in fact the coincidence of the different forms of, photograph versus eyeball. But the fact, I learned then, I'll never forget it, that anybody in one of the spacecraft has such science and technology, they can selectively cut off this perception, that perception, you can still see where you're driving, and on it goes. And certainty, because, we're primitive little pygmies in respect to their knowledge. So I just want to make that one point. The craft.
We want to thank Dr. Andrzej Puharich. It was a fantastic speech. It was unbelievable.